Thank you for coming, for braving the snowstorm, although that's distressingly routine these days. My name is Ed Getz. I'm the Director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our semi-regular CURA Housing Forum. And today we have a really fine set of speakers who will be on a panel to talk. Who will speak about the work that they're doing in the community related to gentrification. So CURA recently published its report on gentrification after a long time, and we've had a couple of CURA Housing Forums to talk about our findings related to gentrification in the Twin Cities. And today's CURA Housing Forum is to focus on the policy responses. So at the end of the report, we talked about a few of the things that were happening around the Twin Cities to address the question of gentrification. And we did that work by interviewing representatives from 10 community-based organizations, which you see on the slide here. Groups that we knew were doing work in gentrification. I will say right away that this was not intended to be a comprehensive list of organizations, because there are many more groups out there doing work. This wasn't even a judgment that these were the most important organizations, although they're doing very important work. And it wasn't meant to be a representative sample either. But what we did was interviewed people from all of these organizations to talk about the work that they were doing. And what we didn't want to do in our policy section was to repeat what we had seen in several other places, which was to simply give a policy toolkit for gentrification. I think that's been done by organizations, and you can see examples of this around online. You can get 2 or 3 different types. So what we wanted to do instead was to highlight work that was being done right here in this metropolitan area. And so through our interviews with representatives from each of these groups, we realized quite quickly that there was a wide range of actions being taken out in the community to address questions of gentrification. And they were different types of interventions, and they also sort of occurred at different stages of neighborhood change. And so we tried to conceptualize the field of work that they were doing in the following ways. I think above the top we talked about different stages of gentrification, including a long sort of lead time that a lot of communities go through, where they begin to experience disinvestment from public and private sector sources. Various institutions end up sort of redirecting resources away from communities, which then sort of leads to a second stage in the process, where a deficit narrative comes to represent the kind of discourse that begins to evolve around a neighborhood. And this discourse related to these communities begins to paint a particular kind of picture about what these communities are and what they're going through. At some point in the process, reinvestment in a neighborhood begins to occur. And this could be reinvestment on the part of private sector actors who begin to capitalize on low land values, on low property values. But the reinvestment begins to change the neighborhood in fundamental ways. Housing costs begin to rise. Businesses may begin to turn over. Cultural institutions may begin to experience pressure. And then finally, at the end of this process is the occurrence of displacement in various forms. in which perhaps the loss of affordable housing can result in pushing out residents or changing conditions within the neighborhood, make it less hospitable to residents who are able to remain, or the lack of affordable housing precludes the entry of others seeking affordable housing in a neighborhood as well. And so displacement occurring in a number of different ways. So what we found was that these organizations were intervening in all of these different stages, and there were strategies for addressing dynamics at each of these stages. And then down below, we noticed from the interviews that we had done that they intervene in a lot of different ways. Certainly through efforts to change public policy, to, for example, initiate greater tenant protections. But we also saw interventions that were focused on redirecting resources, building wealth among residents of these neighborhoods. And then finally, we saw a group of interventions that were about shifting the narrative about these organizations. And so that was the kind of conceptual framework that we built after having interviewed people and representatives from each of these organizations. We have invited representatives from 4 of the organizations, and they will each take 10-15 minutes to talk about the work that they're doing, and then that will leave enough time for a question and answer afterwards. So I would like to invite the panelists up onto the stage to these very comfortable chairs with the water in front of them. And so that includes Monica Bravo of the West Side Community Organization. Tia Williams and Katie Royce from the Frogtown Neighborhood Association. And Marina Sitari-Mumene from ACER, the African Career and Education. And we send the regrets of Jennifer Arnold from Incalitos, who was planning on making it, but couldn't make it at the last moment. But that gives each of our panelists just a few more moments to talk about the work they're doing. And although we hadn't talked about an order of speaking, why don't we just go from our left to right? So Monica, that would give you the floor first.
Yeah. So I am Monica Bravo, and I am the Executive Director of the West Side Community Organization. And one of the things that we've been working on is the Twin Cities Equitable Development Scorecard. And what we've done is adapt that scorecard to the West Side. So just looking at this timeline up here, the disinvestment in neighborhoods, the deficit narrative, up like all the way across the top, that's the story of the West Side. So once upon a time, the West Side was considered the little Ellis Island of St. Paul. It's very much an immigrant community where the first Jewish settlement home was built there, which really attracted quite a few folks from all over really. And so in the 50s, we were a really flourishing neighborhood with a lot of immigrant communities had like businesses and lived in an area called the West Side Flats. It's a beautiful area. If you've never been to the west side of St. Paul, I would really encourage you to visit. Our topography is amazing. We live in the River Valley. We're the only St. Paul neighborhood in St. Paul that exists on the side of the river. So we're a little bit isolated geographically. We have to cross the bridge to get to us, and sometimes that leaves us left out. So it makes for a real tight-knit community, but it also makes for us sometimes to be missed. But if we think about this pathway here, this neighborhood of disinvestment, we have been forgotten about quite intentionally for several years. The housing that was existed on the flats at one time was in the floodplain. So the first peoples who lived there were actually the Dakota people, and they were the first people to have been displaced. And then that area became an immigrant hub. They were the second people to be displaced when the city's eyes were on the riverfront for development of an industrial park. So it would flood, and it was deemed uninhabitable because of the flooding. So the people who lived there were removed and displaced, and then the city decided that they were going to build a flood wall after the families were displaced. After they built the flood wall came an industrial park with the highest industrial uses that you can have. So that industrial park, typically there's a buffer zone between housing and high-use industry. At this time, there was no buffer zone, so housing was butted up right against high industrial use. The land became very toxic. The industrial park didn't last for very long, which when the industrial park left, it left behind all the toxins and just empty land. And also, it became a deficit neighborhood narrative about this neighborhood. The disinvestment and profitability now for that land. So when we're looking at reinvestment, the area of the west side is 70% opportunity zone right now. It's 70% area of concentrated poverty. So one would say that when you begin to talk more about a community's deficits than its assets, you're economically vulnerable. Definitely we have seen businesses close their doors in the last decade, and we've only received a very small percentage of investment and funding over the past decade from the city. That is right now at a turning point, so changing. And as a community organization and the district planning council there, what we're doing is organizing proactively to bring in development now, where the people are centered in the decision-making process, and we're asking the question, who benefits from this development? And making sure that we're at the center of who benefits in this development. So I think that's pretty much what I'm going to share with you in a nutshell. If you'd like to see our equitable development scorecard, it's online. But definitely it centers the voices of the people. We went through a series called Westside Action to Equity about a year ago in partnership with CURA. We had close to 100 people every Saturday morning, all residents in the neighborhood, coming together to find out, okay, what can we do? How do we lift up our neighborhood? How do we claim our story? How do we shift the narrative? How do we bring forward our assets? How do we be proactive? How do we no longer be the neighborhood where large developers come in and create something different for new people to come, and the people who currently exist here who built up the vibrancy of this cultural corridor are priced out. So that's where we began this year-long journey of deep engagement and community coming together to create and adapt the West Side Equitable Development Scorecard. At this time, we're in the process of getting it to the St. Paul Planning Commission to become a small area plan. We hope it will hold teeth as pre-development status when developers come, that we can crack open a conversation about who benefits on a number of spectrums and anchors within the scorecard. Okay.
Okay, so this is really weird. Can you hear me? This is weird. My name is Katie Royce. I'm co-director of the Frogtown Neighborhood Association with Thea Williams, who we get to kind of cheat because then you get to say what I didn't say. Yeah. Having two people on here. I want to say first, though, to thank CURA, Ed, and Dr. Lewis and others that helped kind of redefine how we do research in the community, is how I see what happened with the gentrification research. So building relationships in community, bringing that qualitative data to be equal with the quantitative, which does not happen often. I see it as a real fight against supremacy, white supremacy, which I would say data-driven. So I want to thank Ed and Dr. Lewis and folks that did that, it has been extremely helpful in community. So we're able to, usually the stories are the stories, right? We roll them out if it's a hearing at the legislature. But here it's saying, so the stories are telling us, here's what the story's telling us, and those, the data around gentrification is super important right now. Getting it accepted at both the city, county, state, and neighborhood level. So Frogtown is probably the most diverse, racially diverse, that includes some white folks, in the Twin Cities, I would say. And it's very much a home for new immigrants, has been both a community and a landing place for folks. And that has built a vibrancy and artistry that is hard to miss. And we've been, probably for the last 2 years, very intentional about using art and local artists to define and the problem, redefine. So that narrative thing is super important. Redefining the narrative and building the alternative narrative, which is resiliency and beauty and strength in the communities where we live and work. And that's been a big part. So our small area plan, that's what Monica referenced, is this every 10 years, district councils, which are neighborhood organizations, St. Paul split it up into these then revolutionary district councils. I suppose the idea was revolutionary. Most district councils are not revolutionary. But we have kind of been, and you have kind of been. So they're there. And the importance of those small area plans is they get subsumed into the comprehensive plan, or should be. And usually they're just boring narratives that, with some data, with some quantitative data, very little quantitative data. And we turned it upside down and did a artist-driven, community-driven process called SMAPL, which stands for Small Area Plan. It was directed by a couple of artists of color, Chusaik Lee, who's an internationally acclaimed hip-hop artist, among hip-hop artists. Luckily was on our board, and then became a staff person to lead SMAPL. So SMAPL kind of redefined everything. It turned into a graphic novel, and it is literally all the characters' words in that graphic novel, which is defining what should happen, including policy around not just housing, but housing is a big part of a neighborhood, obviously. Are the words of people of Frogtown, and written by characters of artists that Chusaik had a relationship with, a Frogtowner, and Chusaik was a Frogtowner. We're kind of hyper-local obsessed. And Mike Batson is the young man that did SMAPL. And it's on our website, so you can check it out. In SMAPL, we kind of redefine, and it's kind of a roadmap. It is a roadmap to policies for investing in place, in preserving the Frogtown that everyone that is a Frogtowner and a Rondo, there's a lot of back and forth diaspora, Rondo diaspora, and back and forth with Frogtown and Rondo, is a roadmap to how we preserve those cultures, the multitude of cultures and families that actually live. There's actually people that don't get displaced through this, and the forces of displacement are extreme. So the Green Line was put in. There was a community. I forget the name of it. Jim Urch would remember, but the powers that be got together and wrote a manifesto on what should happen with the Green Line. And one of the statements in there, clearly says no one should be displaced. But there's no policy, no suggestions of how to stop it. So of course, we're being displaced. And rents are along Suburban, which is the Frogtown side, the first block off University. Rents are, it's ground zero for gentrification. It's, rents are going up $300, $400 a month, easy, constantly. Values are rising slower than the rents are, but that's happening too. We want that, so then we're caught as a neighborhood association between the desire for families that have lived there for 40 years and have no equity in their home, to trying to hold stuff down so we don't displace. It's a really complex set of variables, And it's extremely important that some of the work that we've been doing in coalition with the Equity in Place table, which is hosted by the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability, we just call the Alliance now, right? Just the Alliance, is working to address that through a network of cities that include both Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the work to talk about those forces as they appear in both cities, and then talk about policy that we might do together. So the power of both cities working on certain policies together, I don't think can be underestimated, and that's happening as part of that work, of our work, of the coalition work. Monica's part of the coalition as well, as is ACER and the NEMO. So the work, that work that builds on from the neighborhood, so that's the key point. The real issues are being defined, and the strategies to address them are being defined by the people most impacted. We all say that should happen. It hardly ever happens. It's kind of happening, which is extremely important and very powerful, and I think part of what will help us save as much as we can of who we are right now.
She said a lot. So to follow up with that, the last time I was here, I was able to tell the story of the 80-year-old elder that was being threatened to be displaced from out of her housing, which has most definitely worked, has had FNA, Frogtown Neighborhood Association, start to also focus on the Rondo neighborhood. So we have began to develop a housing plan that is combining two neighborhoods of Frogtown and Rondo. As a youngster, I was born and raised in the Frogtown, Rondo, and Midway neighborhoods. Don't ask me just yet how that happened, but it's a blessing, as in the work that I'm doing right now. A lot of the people that are my age are seeing right now how Rondo, which was a historical Black community, is no longer that. And there are Facebook groups on a lot of conversations on how to reclaim our neighborhood as Rondo. And so I'm very excited for the work that will be happening within a year and a half on a housing plan with ACER Robinson. And they are a consulting company. A private planning company that will be helping us design with community that process. And so outside of that, I don't know what more to say. Yeah, that was great.
The cooperative and lands, yeah, and your work.
So my work on cooperatives, right now I'm going through a training, so that North Star cooperative training, where it is that it's through Nexus. And what I'm learning right now through a lot of when I'm thinking about it, the conversations that are going on there, we talk a lot about how the devastations within our communities has also created a lot of different splinters of issues, such as distrust for our neighbors, and how there needs to be a healing process that goes along with that for us to start becoming a cooperative, for us to start working together again as far as housing. When I'm talking to community as well as my family and friends about what I'm going through this training, a lot of people there's a lot of popcorn ideas such as grocery stores. People don't see themselves reflected in different properties or different businesses within our communities. So right now I'm having a flood of ideas coming from a lot of community and what it is that they would like to see and how they would like to build their economic system within the Black community. And so we are also working with the last Black and Brown cooperative that is in the state of Minnesota and is located in Frogtown. It's called Wilder Square Cooperative, on how to even really build what that looks like. What does a board look like, and what does the board do, and how does the board hold the interest of 163 other shareholders? I'm learning that in tandem, I get to use that word twice, but in tandem of how to build cooperatives from scratch, from the start, so that we can start to see ourselves in different businesses, such as, again, grocery stores, restaurants and reclaim Rondo and put some type of culture within that. I was actually having a conversation with a cousin, and she was saying, and I hope this doesn't come out right, but she was saying that it is that we have different cultures everywhere. We have little Africa, we have little Mexico, we have little China, but we do not have a little black community anymore, and it doesn't exist. And if anybody can name one, let me know so that we can go.
And to contextualize the cooperative, so the reason we're involved with re-enlivening the cooperative is that there was a land speculator who became the management company of the cooperative, and at the same time managing was attempting to dissolve the cooperative and brought forth a sale to the shareholders with no public education about what the dissolution of the cooperative meant, that they would lose their ownership, numero uno, but would also be subject then to the whims of the market. And that was beat back by leadership in the cooperative. One of the leaders' name, as God would have made it, is Mr. Battle. So Mr. Battle was the one that said, y'all know what we're voting for, and the whole vote blew up, and we've been organizing since then about a year to bring it back, and the land speculator has taken the law.
And in the promises. But in the promises as well as to make their housing of a different quality, so for them to get the marble top counters and the beautiful amenities. I feel like the board was unknowing of what was being promised to them, and then we're pushing. Of course, you want to live in a house where it is that you have a dishwasher. I lived there for 11 years, we didn't have a dishwasher or marble tops. But it would have been nice. And so in those promises, where the board was getting ready to make a decision that would have destroyed that cooperative.
All right, so again, my name is Nalima Sitati Manene, and I'm the Executive Director of ACER. We're an issue-based organization. We work across the region, but most of our work is concentrated in the northwest suburbs. So I'll just give a little landscape of what the northwest suburbs looks like. So the large cities in the northwest suburbs of Brooklyn Park is one of the large cities in the northwest suburbs, Brooklyn Center. These cities have experienced change over time. So in the mid-1980s, the cities, we had this refugee resettlement, and the cities started experiencing a little bit of change in population, and that population has just continued to increase over time. So Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center are the only two cities in Minnesota that have more people of color than white population. Brooklyn Park, I believe, is almost at 60%. I mean, Brooklyn Center is almost at 60%, and Brooklyn Park is nearing 56%. And that is something that a lot of people, we do work in the suburbs, and I find myself in these tables all the time. People like to talk about Minneapolis and St. Paul all the time, especially when they're talking about communities of color. And so the suburbs tend to be very much forgotten. So 1 in every 4 people in Brooklyn Center is born outside the United States, is foreign born. And 1 in every 5 people in Brooklyn Park is foreign born. And so there's also a lot of diversity in the population of color, the population of color itself, and also within the European population, we also have a significant number of European immigrants in the cities. And so over time, as the population continued to change and transition, these are cities that were mostly considered and also labeled themselves as bedroom communities. Right, so predominantly blue collar, the transition from being predominantly blue collar white communities and started experiencing this diverse, population. And so historically, what has happened in this country is that when a lot of people of color tend to live, together, there's some disinvestment that happens, both public and private disinvestment. And so the northwest suburbs is not unique to that factor when you look at that spectrum. So a big part of the work that we do is when these pressures started happening, we were in the process, we were engaged in planning for the Blue Line extension. So we were doing a lot of engagement on the Blue Line extension corridor. And so in the process of doing our work, we realized that we had people were experiencing a lot of difficulty around housing. And so we started bringing this issue forward to local government, but housing was just not a priority for any of the councils in Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, New Hope, Crystal, Robbinsdale. You know, in fact, during that time, the city of Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, and Richfield filed a complaint with HUD and said that, you know, they had an over concentration of poverty, and that, you know, NHFA and other entities were investing too much in affordable housing and were concentrating poverty, and that was a problem for them. And so when we heard about those complaints, we were very surprised because we were engaging our community and we knew that people were housing cost burdened. So even though the city councils were claiming they had an overabundance of affordable housing, we were wondering where the affordable housing was, because people were spending, and they're still spending easily over 50% of their income, you know, in housing. And so a big part of our work has been about asking the question about who gets to define what the problem is. So number one, the way the problem was being defined itself was problematic. So we tend, when it comes to housing and economic development, we tend to define these issues around spaces. There's a special, we do a special analysis, and you know that is a problem. Spaces do not get discriminated against. People get discriminated against. And so we were reading all the solutions and documents about over-concentration of poverty. So the solution is let us deconcentrate this poverty. So let's just everybody have their fair share of these poor people of color, but let them continue being poor, right? There was no conversation about how do we actually lift people out of poverty, one. Number two, there was no analysis about the role of the system, the structural racism that was happening that actually, you know, intentionally caused, you know, these people to be poor. So we have been doing a lot of organizing tenants. So a lot of this, you know, overabundance of so-called affordable housing that we're claiming, the cities were claiming to have, is actually, it's unsubsidized housing. So this term, you know, naturally occurring affordable housing is a term that I really hate because, yeah, you know, this house, so it just refers to housing that is considered affordable, but no public subsidy is going into it. But nobody ever stops to ask the question, why is it below, you know, below market rate? Because there is no investment that goes back in it. People are living under deplorable conditions. People should not be living, you know, in that housing. And so the solution, because the way the system tends to define this problem is we have a concentration of poverty, was let us discuss people that have a concentration of poverty. But when we talked to people in our community and say, what would you like to see happen? People wanted to live in their communities. People want to continue living in their communities. What they wanted was to live under better conditions. And so that is what we started, you know, pushing for. And so it raises this question about who gets to define the problem, who's sitting at the table, and who is coming up with a solution. So what we do, the way we do our work, we say we're not exclusive about race, but we're definitely exclusive about race. Because every year in Minnesota, we produce these equity reports, and, you know, and every year, you know, we see that the disparities, the greatest disparities are along racial lines. And we know that especially Black people are usually, you know, suffer the greatest disparities of all. And so we are very explicit about naming race in the work that we do, because it plays a big part. When you look at the statistics about who is most housing cost burdened and who is being impacted the most, it is mostly low wealth people of color. And so we have to name that. And so in that respect, they need to be at the table. We need to be engaging them. And so that is what we started doing, is engaging the tenants and saying, what would you like to see happen? And so we started bringing this forward, you know, to the city councils to talk about it. The northwest suburbs, so there's some external pressures that the Northwest suburbs are currently facing. Most of the cities in the Northwest suburbs will tell you they're built up communities, or the ones that are not. So like Brooklyn Park is 90% built up, and there's so many plans waiting on the pipeline to be approved, and whatnot. So is Brooklyn Center. So there's because of the long-term disinvestment, we're on that spectrum. So the disinvestment happens. So then there's a deficit narrative, and then property values go down, and then all of a sudden there are all this speculators and investors keyed up, and so a lot of that is happening in the Northwest suburbs, Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, Crystal, New Hope. So there's a lot of redevelopment prospects happening. We have a major public investment that we're anticipating, the Blue Line extension, and we do know that when we look at issues of displacement and gentrification across the country, we know that especially light rail transit corridors tend to be a catalyst. If they're not planned for well, they tend to be a catalyst for gentrification and displacement. And in fact, it happens within the first year. When the health equity, the health impact assessment was done for the Blue Line corridor, that is one of the things that came out of the health impact assessment, was that the Blue Line was a great investment, but if there was no intentionality about engaging the low wealth people of color who it was supposed to benefit, then it is actually going to be detrimental to those communities. They're going to end up being displaced. So a big part of the work that we have done, we also work with Hennepin County to do a housing gap analysis, which actually just served to be able to report again, once again, what the community has always known, that people are housing post-burden, people are living under deplorable conditions, and etc. So in terms of strategy, we organize tenants because we believe that the people who are most impacted are the ones who are best placed to define what the issue is and to come up with the best solutions. We have been working on advocating for policy change because we need a change in policy in how, whether it's local government or the state government, addresses this issue. So our strategies center around, increasing production of affordable housing, preservation of the affordable housing, and protection of tenants' rights. So we have been working with a number of organizations. The Housing Justice Center, who have a lot of good housing attorneys, helped us come up with a series of ordinances that we felt, but we knew cities, there are things that cities can do. So we work from a very local level to a state level and to a national level to advocate for housing, because there are some things that are within the jurisdiction of the cities, and there are things that cities can do, things like making sure that, their housing is preserved and that tenants' rights are protected, because that's a big part of it. So some of the outcomes of our work is, a few years ago, we went to the city of Brooklyn Park and we said, we have a huge eviction problem in Brooklyn Park. People are being evicted at such an alarming rate. And, the city did not believe us, so we brought tenants to testify, et cetera, And so the city commissioned for an eviction report to be done. And I think one of the main reasons the city actually agreed to do this is because they didn't believe us. They thought we were actually going to prove us wrong. But they were even more surprised. We were both shocked by the numbers that came out. So we have a very high eviction rate in Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center. And I think actually the cities of Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center, I think, have the highest eviction rate, in the state of Minnesota. And so that serves to destabilizes the communities. We also are part of the Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition. So a big part of this work is engaging the community. And when it comes to the suburbs, there's always this narrative like, we could never be able to build affordable housing, in Medina and etc. But it is possible. So with the Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition, which we're part of, what we have done is that we have different housing communities and coalitions in different parts of the suburban Hennepin. We have housing groups that have been working with the residents and city councils to bring them along and to say we need to address this housing issue. And the cities like Edina say you need to make a commitment to affordable housing. So for example, The city of Edina, which, they have a lot of businesses and etc. And they found out that, and they're proud of their businesses, they love their businesses, but they found out that a lot of the restaurants they love and the retail stores, none of those employees could afford to live in the city. And they were traveling from very far to come and work those jobs, and they're not really earning much. And also the business owners realize that they have a high rate of turnover because it just becomes expensive, over time. So this idea of, affordable housing is an investment, right? It's an investment also for the community, so that we can kind of changing the narrative. A big part of our work is also giving agency to, once again, to the people who need to be at the table so that they can be able to name the issue that is impacting them. Some of the work that we've been able to achieve is, so the city of Brooklyn Park passed a mixed income housing policy last year. And so what that means is that any developer who comes into the city and wants to build any housing, and if they get any concession, then they'll have to have a certain percentage of affordable housing in the mix. So one of the things we're most proud about is that we did a really big push to include 30% AMI, area median income. So this conversation about affordable, why I really don't even like to talk about affordable housing is because what is affordable? Affordable is such a relative term. I mean, I like to say, how do we make housing affordable? Because when we talk about how do we make housing affordable, then there's some things that need to go along with it. That means that cities should not just be talking about subsidizing housing, but they should be thinking about what should wages look like. Wages should match the rising cost of living in this, in the cities that have jurisdiction over. So the mixed income housing policy, the 30% AMI, that is where the greatest need is, right? A lot of the housing that is being built is 60%, 80% AMI, which is ridiculous. 30% area median income is very small. So if we're going to be truthful about addressing this problem, that is what we need to be looking at. Another aspect of our work is, of course, you need political will. So organizing is great, building allyship is great. You need to put pressure, but you also have to build a political will for this work, to be able to happen. So I happen to work in the city that I live in. We're a 501c3. We do not endorse candidates. We do not, we don't endorse candidates. But, I live in Brooklyn Park. So part of the work that I've been able to do on an individual level. So when it comes to political will, you either persuade people to have the political will, or you change the people who are there. And so for us, it has been twofold. So for some people, we have been able to bring them along. We had an election last year. For some people, we had to change. We had to change the decision makers. So as community groups, we have the ability to either create a political will or change, or change the political will, change whoever is there so that they can be able to do that. The last thing I will say, so a lot of times whether it's the county or the state, when they're thinking about where do they invest their money for housing, people, tend to invest, and nonprofit developers should be funded to do their work and etc. But we need to bring the community along, and so one thing I always advocate about is we need to fund organizing. We need to fund organizing. It has to be, if we are committed to doing this work, it has to be part of the budget. It has to be part of any city's housing budget, any state's housing budget. We need to fund organizing because it is part of the equation of moving this work along.
And I would just add
Yes, go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I would just include right after Nalima's thought of the other things cities can do. There's lots of stuff cities can do for affordable housing and anti-displacement and anti-gentrification work. But the other thing is they hold land. They own land. They own properties. We hope that part of what the city does as part of its payback. I'm not going to use the word reparations here purposely, but that kind of, hey, we did this corridor strategy, development strategy document. We said there's no displacement. We didn't do anything to make sure there wasn't any displacement. So now we're gonna cede the land we own, number of lots, some housing, to community land trusts. So right now, that's how you pay us back, and the community gets to define what happens on those lots or with those structures. So that's city, state, federal, who owns what in the Frogtown Rondo and who should be owning it. And I'm not saying FNA should own it, but there should be a land trust or the like that owns that property.
All right, thank you very much to our speakers. We do have time for question and answer. There will be a microphone roaming the room, so I'm looking for people who have questions. But I will note, I forgot to note at the beginning that we are live streaming this, and it will be posted, I think, on YouTube within a week. So, in case you weren't here and wanted to see it later, I suppose it would be. All right. So, any questions for any of the speakers?
If anyone knows how to save a Facebook live stream and make it into a YouTube, we need to know how to do that. Really, come in and talk to us after.
While we wait for the first hand, I have a question that I'd like to follow up with Monica with. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more in detail about what the scorecard is looking for. What are the kinds of things that you are scoring and that you are trying to incentivize with the scorecard?
Sure. So the scorecard is based on pillars, right? So it's when a potential developer comes, it's community engagement. So are you engaging our neighborhood? At what level are you engaging us? And then there's a ranking on your level of deep engagement with our community. There's a ranking on the level of affordable housing units that you will bring. There's a ranking on employment. There's a ranking on transportation. There's a ranking across the board for the conversation with the developer. And depending on their score, it depends on how we begin to negotiate what it is that we're going to have and who's going to benefit in the neighborhood.
And local awareness.
But absolutely.
Question, Jonathan. Hello.
This is a great session, and I wonder, Nalima, with your mixed income policy, and you were able to get to 30% of area median income, is that 10%? And was there any pushback on the idea that where is that subsidy going to come from? Because in St. Paul, I have been a broken record talking about that as a city person, and I'm getting all this pushback that there isn't money available to get to that deep level of subsidy for 30%.
Sure. So the mixed income housing policy, I think the requirement for the 30%, I think is between like 5. So the different categories, it will be like, I think between about 5 to 10% of will be 30% AMI, and then there'll be different tiers, and then it will also allow for some, like 50% AMI also. In terms of where the subsidy will come from, so the policy applies to any developer who comes into the city and says, I would like to build some housing, but I want, I would like a public concession, whether it's a rezoning or TIF, or to be in the TIF district, and etc. And actually, what I will add to that is we're bringing the policy back to the council this year to do an amendment to say that anything that is going to be built within the transit-oriented development, because a big part of the work that we did too was do community engagement, for the station area planning. And what we're able to do is to get all the station area plans incorporated into the comprehensive plan. And so we realized realized, we have already done the work. So the developer came and wanted to develop, by the station area, then the rezoning will have already, because we did a 1-year moratorium around, the station area plan, and so nobody was able to submit a plan or develop there, so the whole lot, so that the land was rezoned. And so it will be twofold. Anybody who's coming to ask for public concession, and then, so after we do the amendment, anybody who comes who would like to build housing, within a 1-mile radius of the station, then we'll also have to adhere to the mixed income housing policy.
Thank you. I think you touched on some of my question. I'm from Los Angeles, and what we found in LA is that a lot of these rail and subway projects are sold as community investment. It's going to help the community, but it's more corporate real estate projects that was turns into development. We build a station, and all of a sudden within a year or two, you got these huge, unaffordable housing developments there. How do you plan to address those issues? Because I imagine they were talking about increasing those kind of projects in the area. I don't know if they are or not. But just in general, how do you deal with transportation as far as a housing project and keeping people in the neighborhood and keeping people to get to and from jobs where they come? How do you see that play out in your developments? Anybody here? For all of you on the panel.
So I'll go first real quick. So for us, with the Blue Line extension, which hasn't been built, a lot of what we have done is look at areas like, Frogtown, the Green Line corridor, and learned a lot about, what has happened there. As I said before, one of the big challenges, especially, so for example, for the city of Brooklyn Park, right now, they've planned for 5 stations. We could get all 5 of them, or maybe not all of them. Part of the challenge in Brooklyn Park, as I mentioned before, it's almost built out. And then, so as Katie mentioned before, it becomes an issue of who owns the land. So some of the land, in Brooklyn Park, some of it the city owns, some of them is privately owned, and the economic development authority in the city is trying to put parcels of land together. So right now, what we have is a lot of plans, and also trying to do a lot of community engagement and really trying to work with the city to say what are some tools and strategies that we can be able to apply. I mean, ideally, we would have this, we'll put this land in a community land trust, so we could stay, so that the community could be able to afford it. But so, like for example, something like the mixed income housing policy, bringing back that amendment to ensure that we do have, some 30% AMI affordability, along the, in the transit-oriented development of housing is one of the strategies, but we're still exploring other means of doing that.
Some of the stuff that was done did happen in the midst of the development of the Green Line in St. Paul, and that was by community organizations that were not supported by the city, and kind of not supported by the local foundation community, and that was to get the 3 stops that were going to be run through, right? And those stops are now, at least have the opportunity right now to continue to remain in community, although the pressures for development are like I said, extreme. And this new opportunity zone crap that has come in through the tax law is scary and could explode stuff if someone decided on a new build somewhere. But it also has given us treasures like the Heritage Tea House. If everyone has not been there, please go. It's at Western University. That's an African-American owned, might be, well, the hair place, bless it. But there's 2 African-American owned businesses along the university. Can't count 2 African-American businesses. And one of them came because of that stop work. So that's at Western. So that we did do some of that work. But now, because the powers that be did develop without real policies in place, now is the catch-up time, right? So rent controls on the table everywhere.
The discussion around cooperatives and housing and who owns it, absolutely. The 30% is huge. Insisting on, way more than 30% and below. So it's 30% and below that needs housing. And then policies around right to return. So that is not a policy that has really been used. So we're talking about people that have been economically displaced already. And these are longtime Rondo and Frogtown individuals and families who can now no longer, Tia, tried to move into Frogtown last year, could not. And so that making sure that when we do subsidize, whether it's with TIF or the infrastructure money or the direct subsidy to housing, that the right to return and the right for people who live presently in the community to move into those units, we have to do that. And there's some fair housing, and I don't mean to blah blah fair housing because the fair housing law has helped a lot over the years. But right now, laws that used to help that can hinder need to get looked at. And so market interventions that we don't do because we're not socialists need to get done. And that's the kind of getting the powers that be and the elected officials at a place where they understand that and are willing to develop laws that are interventive to capitalist markets. Has to happen on this if we're going to come out of this. Uh-oh.
I would say exactly the same as what Katie said. We're talking about the same things. We're sitting on the same coalitions together, and the right to return is a huge one for us too. But also, like I said, in our scorecard, we're looking at new development coming that you're within a quarter mile of a transit corridor. So on the west side already, our transit system, it lacks routes and time for folks to get from where they need to be. And we know right now that, I think it's like number 1 or number 2 barrier to upward mobility for communities of color is actually transit. It's like getting to that employer, getting to the places that you need to be so that you can move upward. And so we know that that's like a very critical issue, but then I would ask also to look at transit policies. So it's like a chicken and egg right now. We will build more frequent stops when we see more users. Well, we will and we will have more users if you have more frequent stops, or if you can get us from A to B. So, I think looking at how you're investing in the transit corridors, and that's a whole separate policy entity in itself, but paying attention to it, right, and making sure that the development for housing that we have is close to the transit corridors that we do have, that do exist, and then understanding how we can get better transportation actually on the west side. We're not in like a blue line coalition or a green line, although there has been talk of a rapid bus line running right down the middle of our neighborhood. It went away. I don't know if the talk will pick back up again, but if it does, we want to be ready. So these are the kinds of conversations that we're having, and we're also learning with our partners in the coalition.
It's also worth noting that CURA has replicated the quantitative portion of our gentrification study in suburban Hennepin County, and we found 3 clusters of census tracts that are changing in ways that are consistent with gentrification, and each of them coincides with a transit line. There's a cluster on the north side, where northwest suburbs, where Melina is doing her work. There's a cluster along the southwest line in St. Louis Park and Hopkins, and then there's a cluster along a bus rapid transit line in Ridgefield and Bloomington. So this continues to be an issue.
Hi, everybody. I so appreciate all your work, all your hard work for your communities and your people. I'm just wondering, what's a story of what works? Sometimes we get stuck in the narrative of like, has to be market-driven development, no subsidies can really serve the level of affordable housing you need, and the whole dominant narrative about being deficit of neighborhoods. How do we shift that to Kelly pointing out, getting something that works, that we can tell our communities this is how, however imperfect it might have transgressed or whatever, move forward. Here's something that we did that worked. Does anybody have a?
Other than the ones you heard? So 30% resourcing in place, getting policy where the land is owned by the community, but beyond that, you mean like specific policy, what are you?
Or development, I'm thinking more specifically a building that was done in a way that really worked for a community.
I think we're on the edge of doing that. I don't think we're at a place where that we've done it yet. But we have laid the groundwork, pun is intended, to do that.
I think too, if we look across the country, there are examples of other cities that have put some things in place that do work. One thing that I think we can all collectively agree on is that we know organizing works. We know that organizing to build the public will to shift the policies works. And so we know that, we can each, I think, cite examples across the board of when, more often than not, it's us coming to a reactionary space, right, where we're actually having to fight off a large developer or fighting for some detail of a contract to have the language that says that you must meet with the community and the language that says that you must have X number of affordable housing. But even just to get those small wins in contract language with large developers takes an organizing effort, at this stage. And so we know that if we can organize for the policy changes that we need, we can build the will of the people, that works. So we just need to get together and start organizing around the right policies to put the infrastructure in place. That's what I think.
Thank you. A little context to kind of explain my question first. I lived in Korea for a while, and they had a policy to rapidly increase housing density and supply. They call it key money. It's basically you put more money you put down to rent your unit, it lowers your monthly rent, and it lets the developer almost instantly put up a brand new apartment building the second they open the first one. And in that context, housing density is a really, really big and essential part of affordable housing for folks. I think they raised the population of Seoul from like 5 million or 10 million or something up to 30 million. And I don't often hear folks talk about how housing density will play a role in the future of affordable housing and good high quality living in cities here in the U.S. I wondered if you guys could share some wisdom and knowledge on that topic.
Bless you.
Sure. So I'll go first. So yes, that's a fun. So housing density is a question. From what I've observed in the Twin Cities, I think most of what is going up is high density housing, but it is very expensive, and out of reach. For example, in Brooklyn Park, we put high density housing for the first time, I think about 3 years ago. The cities hadn't done any high density in over 20 years, but it is the most expensive housing in the city, and it's not, there's still vacancies in there. I think there's a lot of high density housing going on in the North Loop and etc., and we still have homelessness. Homelessness is still increasing in the city of Minneapolis. It's not decreasing. It's not really. So the need has to be matched with what is being supplied. So, for example, when it comes to whether we're looking at, like affordable housing or nowhere, we're losing like about 100 units a week of this housing, right? And then for the affordable housing need, there's not enough supply. But for the high market range, there are 3 units for every 1 person. who's in that market, right? So there's an abundance of supply, for the high market, but there's nowhere near enough, for the people who, for the people who need it the most. So I'm not sure that, that just saying, there is a place for high density housing, but it's not, it doesn't automatically resolve the issue. We need to be building where, to meet the needs of the greatest need. That's what it is at the end of the day.
I will say though that these folks that we're partnering with on this Frogtown Rondo housing plan, this is a professional, a private planning company that comes from Japan. The owner is Japanese and then has built this team. They're in a bunch of states. They just opened their Minneapolis office, but so we were planning our first kind of putting out in the community this idea of the housing plan the other night, and did it with a bunch of poetry and again that artistry infused into the meeting, just an important side. But he was kind of insisting when we were doing the planning of this event that he'd do his PowerPoint. We're like, well, let's say it this way, or let's put this in there. And he's pretty insistent on this idea of the trickle-down stuff, and talking about encouraging upper-income housing, maybe downtown, or not in Frogtown Rondo, but somewhere to let off the pressure that would allow for affordable housing to be built. I've never seen trickle-down work, but this guy's pretty sharp, the company's pretty sharp. Partnerships are about learning both ways. And so if we're insistent on this 30% and we're all, pathological housing advocates, which we are, it's nice to have that come in as kind of a market suggestion and for us to take it on in community though. That's the important thing. So that kind of strategy of trickle down comes into community and we have the real conversation about how to make it work with the people that are experts, and that's community people in their own lives. So that's where I find it will be interesting and probably effective.
With that question, it's for us a little bit tricky. So as I mentioned earlier, we do live literally right along the riverfront, and so it is a federally natural protected area. It is the river valley, and so there's always this tension between stewards and protectors of this natural topography and space, right? And the thought about population growth and density as we think about planning for the future. And so the existence of both of those things, like thoughtfully being stewards of the natural environment that we have, but also thinking about the population growth that's coming. And so it's a little bit of give and take, but we also, it is a tricky space. I'm not gonna, say that it isn't. There's a lot of controversy around it. And so we're cautious, we enter it cautiously, knowing that we do need density. So that's my answer right now.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm a late bloomer, graduate student here at the Humphrey, very interested in affordable housing. I'm trying to visualize what is the biggest barrier? If there was some foundation that said, okay, we're going to put some money toward a project in your neighborhood, and you can do with it what you want. How could you see it happening? Who would administer that? Are there, I think the community visioning, if there were a shovel-ready plan, how could that bring things together? Just kind of tossing out ideas of a specific vision and who would do it and how much money would you need.
Yeah, I just think it's such a complex. These issues bring in all of the issues around white supremacy and policy use against communities of color and indigenous communities, that there is no one answer. And that's kind of a white supremacist model. What's the one thing we can do for you? I do think though, if it was a bunch of money,
Yeah, right. If it was a bunch of money in the grand vision, then you have to be assured that the community is the lead in the author of their own plan. And then, sure, give us all the money we can use. Subsidy on housing will be an absolute critical. Right now, the public housing authorities are devastated by constant attacks from the federal government. Attacks meaning taking away money and not giving more. And so that's a huge inventory that we need to pay attention to, and that would be part of that. You guys have one thing now?
One thing, I think so. Housing is on the lack there of affordable housing, the lack of is a very multi-layered issue that it's just impossible to say that, if there's one thing, if there's one development, and so, the one thing that could solve this issue is if we ended structural racism.
Yes.
So it is a foundation that wants to invest in a Wally project. We should fund the dismantling of structural racism, and then we don't just get to solve the housing problem, we get to solve all these other systemic, and other, social issues that, because that is a real issue. And like I said before, we approach housing, this issue of housing as a special, in terms of space and development, and it isn't. It is about systemic racism, and because you have to look at, who is being impacted and why is it that only, a certain part of the population, is mainly being impacted, and so we have to approach it, as such. Now, when we talk about housing, there are two things. We talk about housing as a market commodity, and I think that is where, so I've worked in community development for a long time. I know I'm a passionate housing organizer, and that is the space I like to be in. And a lot of times, the tensions that we're facing is that because we are trying to solve a human rights, we're trying to solve a shelter issue, but we have here housing as other people are trying to solve a market, housing as a market commodity, right? So one of the big problems we have is that in the United States, housing is a market commodity. Even though the market has proved to us over and over again that they're incapable of regulating housing, it is still a housing commodity, right? And the other problem is that government is very hesitant to intervene when it is impacting people, but then when it is impacting financial institutions and the banks are too large to fail, and then we don't have a problem with big government coming in to intervene, right? And so there is a hypocrisy that exists. Like housing has to continue being a market commodity, then the housing market has to allow some kind of government intervention that also is able to secure people's shelter. As that's third grade social science, Maslow's hierarchy, right? Clothing, food, and shelter is a necessity.
That's where I would go with that. And just one more quick thing I wanted to add. There was policies, investments in those policies and practices. So we need to invest in the practices and policies and decommodifying the housing, or invest in policies and practices that are going to right this wrong. So that's something else that money could go towards.
You've all talked about the importance of community engagement in meaningful ways, not just as a way to get input, but also as a way to, and more importantly, as a way to really identify solutions. So community engagement can mean different things to different people. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as effective community engagement and what it looks like when it's done right?
So I feel like FNA tries really hard not to use the term community engagement unless that it is, if there's like some particular to dig in as the liquor license or the litter, let's have these conversations. However, when it comes down to talking about housing and its urgency, I think we want to use the word organizing. That's more of the term I feel like gives ownership to the community, and also it creates that leadership and allows for the community to start creating decisions that concern their neighborhoods. And I hope I got to the gist of kind of what you asked, but the importance, was that what your question was, like, the importance of community engagement? Or what it looks like? I think is, it's building relationships. So it's not going just to door knock and talk to people for, like one time. And that's kind of what community engagement is knocking on the door and then you don't see me anymore. Whereas organizing is, we're constantly having conversations about what's going on. When it has to do with housing, going in and talking, to me, it's talking about my relation to having issues with housing, and then allowing for people to tell me their story, and then inviting them to tables and committees or to work with the SMAPL, and work on the SMAPL and giving information and helping us develop how these different documents are going to be developed.
And what they look like. So SMAPL is a graphic novel, and the language and the characters are directly from Frogtown, and the people that developed that document are people from the community. So it's hiring, hyper-local hiring, hyper-local voice, and then an end product that everyone can enjoy and get information from.
So just real quick, I think community engagement is done well. Being very clear with the community about, what you want. So a lot of times institutions, what they're really doing is just doing, so there are 4 levels of community engagement. I'm not going to deliver the whole places here. So, but a lot of times what is being done is community information, and that is not community engagement. So people come like, oh, we need to spread this information out. People are already coming to convey to you things that decisions have already been made about. And then sometimes people catch themselves trying to do, a better job, and what they do is community input. So people just come, get input from the community, and then they go away, and then people become angry, like, but this is not what we say. We want it right. And granted, we're not saying that community engagement should be done so that, you can't promise the community everything, especially if it's just not realistic, because also community will have differing opinions, right? But I think what is important is like being very clear about what level of community engagement you're trying to do with community from the very beginning. Now, what is ideal community engagement is this idea of co-creating with the community, right? So that means that community is engaged and involved from the very beginning, not after you have made the decisions, not after you have done whatever and then trying to engage. So because I lead a community organization, it's always like, oh, we made this decision, go and sell it to your community, go and make your community informed, and that is not community engagement. So once again, this idea that the community that is being impacted should be part of defining what the problem is, so that it can be defined well, and then you start that process of co-creating together. And then what does that space look like? Okay, so that's another thing. A lot of times we get invited into these hostile spaces, which are not good for our mental well-being, right? So it's not just about us saying, oh, we've created this table and it's open for community, and why isn't community, showing up? So there's a lot that, that goes into it, and the point at which community is brought in is what is critical, because they're the ones who can help you after they've defined the problem. They should be part of helping create the table and shape what that process looks like, so that the community can be able to engage in a meaningful way. So for example, I've worked in housing community development for a long time. We have our own community, housing speak, right? So a lot of times community is invited and all these experts are talking this language that people don't even understand, and people are like, I know I'm not dumb, but why do I feel dumb? And I cannot participate in this process. you know? So there's just, good community engagement is really thinking through that process and being genuinely invested. I mean, it takes a lot of work, but being genuinely invested in bringing, in bringing community, along with you. But the other thing I will add to that is you also have to realize that if systems were genuinely hiring people that were representative of community, we would barely have this problem to begin with, right? We would all be able to navigate this process.
Thank you. One thing, I just love everything that you all are saying, so I'm right in there with you. The other thing that I would comment just on this one, to add to that, is time. So the timeline of development, the timeline of process, right, is often rushed. And to do a good job, to have it authentic, it takes time. So giving it the time that it takes to do a good job with it and authentically engaging the community.
I think we're facing that timeline thing with the anti-displacement network work we're doing. So it's development has its own timeline and everyone wants to do it on the developer's timeline, right? So is policy. Policy also shouldn't be getting ahead of community. So even though we're in this rush, we need this policy. I want it right now. We really need to bring community along with it so that we watch for whatever's going to show up as white supremacy in the problem.
So speaking of time, we're out of it. And I would like to I would invite you to join me in thanking